Our presenter today is Chantel Hardaway. Ms. Hardaway began her Commonwealth career in 2008 with the Department of Revenue and Human Services, where she worked in training and development. In November of 2017, she joined the Customer Experience Center as the Chief of Outreach and Education, where she works to build relationships with outside organizations and increase outreach and education initiatives on behalf of the Department of Revenue. This includes coordinating webinars, educational video content, as well as in-person presentations. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Chantel.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar to talk about the Property Tax and Rent Rebate Program. So just to provide you with a brief overview of what we'll cover today, we'll do a very brief overview of the history of the program. We're going to talk about the eligibility requirements and some of the important dates for filing a claim. And then we'll spend the majority of our time actually walking through the PA 1000 form and some of the information and tips on how to fill out each of the sections. We'll also walk through some of the schedules that may or may not need to be included when a claimant is filing for a property tax rent rebate claim. And then we will just very briefly look at some additional resources as well as providing some tips and recommendations that we have for folks that are filing their forms. So very brief history of the program. The Property Tax Rent Rebate Program began in 1971 under Act 3 of 1971. The program provides rebates to qualifying older Pennsylvanians and those with disabilities on property tax or rent paid. The rebates are funded by the Pennsylvania Lottery. There are also some supplementary property tax rebates, and those are funded by slots gaming. Since the inception of the program has paid out more than $6.7 billion, and we want to make sure that we continue to pay out even more in the future. So let's take a look at some of the eligibility requirements. The program is geared towards Pennsylvanians age 60 or older, or Pennsylvanians under the age of 65 with a spouse who is age 65 or older, widows or widowers age 50 or older, or individuals with a disability age 18 and older. And the program is for property owners with income less than $35,000, renters with income less than $15,000, or property owners and renters with income less than $35,000. And as we go through the form, we'll talk about what we mean in terms of income and how you calculate income. In terms of the rebate amounts, it's based on a sliding scale based on income. The maximum rebate for the program for property owners is $650, and the maximum rebate for renters is $650. The maximum supplemental rebate is $325 added to that. And again, these are the maximum amounts based on income. The supplemental rebate is for property owners in the Pittsburgh School District, Philadelphia area, or Scranton area, or those that have property taxes that are equal to or more than 15% of their total income. The supplemental rebate is actually calculated by our system, so for purposes of calculating how much the rebate is in terms of a claimant, the claimant will just calculate the actual rebate amount that they would expect to get. And once it comes into the department, we would calculate any supplemental rebate if applicable. Okay, so some important dates to keep in mind with the forms. So in late January, so actually on the 23rd of January, the forms became available for the previous claim year. So just like with taxes, the program is based on the previous claim year. And then starting this month, the department starts to send out automated calls for anyone who has already submitted their form just to let them know that we have received the form. Then in June, two important things happen. We start sending out automatic calls stating that the rebate was approved and that the direct deposit will begin on July 1st of the year. And also in June, it's important to note that the standard application deadline is June 30th for each year. The governor may extend the deadline for filing, and typically in recent years it has been extended to December 31st of each year, but we generally encourage people to file as soon as possible rather than wait to see if the deadline has been extended. And then by law, July 1st is the first day that we are allowed to send payments out, whether that be through direct deposit or whether that be an actual check. And so regardless of when someone files, July 1st is the first date that we are authorized to send payments out. So let's talk about the PA 1000 form, which is the property tax rent rebate form. So the form has 2 pages, and we are going to go over the form in detail with all of the sections. So the first part of the form is Section A. This part of the form is really important because it's some key demographic information that we need to make sure that the claim gets processed. So where it says your Social Security number, that is the full Social Security number for the primary or qualifying individual who is filing as the claimant. If the claimant has a spouse, the spouse's Social Security number, and again, the full Social Security number, should also be included on the form, provided that they reside in the same household all year. Next up is the claimant's name and address. The spouse's name and middle initial also needs to be included on the form. Something that's important in this section that sometimes people miss is the county code and school district codes. Those codes must be entered on this form. If the claimant does not know those codes, they're actually listed in the back of the book. So they are available there. We also need the claimant and the spouse's birth dates, as well as a daytime telephone number. We ask for a daytime telephone number and a good contact number so that we can make sure that as we're making those automated calls that the claimant is receiving that. So we do ask for a good daytime telephone number for the claimant. Next up is Section B of the form. So the first part of Section B is based on the filing status for the previous year. So if the claimant owned their home for the entire year, they would fill in the oval for property owner. If the claimant rented for the entire year, they would file as a renter, and if the claimant both owned and rented, they would file as an owner-renter. Sometimes this may happen if someone owns a mobile home but is renting the land that the mobile home is on. That would be one of the examples of how someone may be an owner and a renter at the same time. The next part for number 2 in Section B is the claimant's eligibility status, so whether they are filing based on age, based on the age of their spouse, as a widow or widower, or as being permanently disabled. The last area 3 in Section B, is if the claimant is deceased and a surviving spouse, estate, or personal representative is filing on their behalf. Now, if the spouse is filing on their behalf, what we would recommend is that the spouse look and see if they are eligible to file either based on age or if they're eligible based on their widow or widower status, and then file as themselves. And so meaning that they are filing the form on their own behalf rather than filing on behalf of the decedent. There's also a oval box in Section A that says if spouse is deceased, fill in the oval, and that's the oval you would fill in if the spouse was deceased. So for first-time filers, there is some documentation that we need, and it's important that it's sent in with the claim so that we can make sure that we get these processed timely. So for first-time filers, we need proof of age if the claimant is age 65 or older. If the claimant is filing based on being 64 years or younger, but the spouse is age 65, we still also need proof of age there. If the claimant is filing as a widow or widower, we do again need proof of age because they need to be age 50 to 64 and a copy of the death certificate. If the claimant is filing based on a disability and being ages 18 through 64, and I apologize, there's a typo on the slide, but it's 18 to 64, and has a permanent disability, then we would need proof of age and proof of disability. So next is Section C of the form, and we're going to go through this line by line because it's really hard to see up here. So an important note for Section C, if there's no amount to report for any of these lines, please leave them blank. Line 4 is used for Social Security, SSI, or SSP income. So for this income, the total amount is written on the line, and then it's divided by 2, and that number is then entered on line 4. So basically for Social Security, we take half of that income, and that's what we count as income. It's half of that amount. For line 5, this is used to report railroad retirement Tier 1 benefits. And again, as with Social Security benefits, because they're considered equivalent, the total amount from box 5 on the RRB 1099 is put on that line, divided by 2, and then line 5 is that amount that's been divided by 2. For line 6, this is any pension, annuity, or IRA distributions or railroad Tier 2 benefits, and those are reported as straight amounts. Railroad retirement Tier 2 benefits are viewed as a private, or like a private pension, so those are reported in its entirety, whereas the railroad Tier 1 benefits are considered more like Social Security. So that's the difference between the two and why they're reported on different lines. So the proof documents for this might be a 1099-R or an RRB 1099-R. Depending on the form, it may be green or it may be blue. And I apologize, just going back real quick, one important thing to note is that federal veterans disability payments or state veterans payments are not reported. So those are not counted as income for purposes of property tax rent rebate. Line 7 is used to report any interest and or dividend income. The proof documents would be a 1099 INT or a 1099 DIV. The claimant could also send in a copy of the Federal Form 1040 Schedule B or the PA 40 Schedule A and B, where those amounts would be reported as well for in terms of proof documentation for this income. Line 8 and several other lines after this are used to report a loss. So the claimant may use losses to offset gains, but the income category must be consistent, meaning that they may only offset a loss from a sale against a gain from a sale in the same income category. The ownership must also be consistent, meaning that the claimant can only offset a loss that they have incurred from their gain, not from their spouses. So that's important to remember when you're looking at who is listed as the claimant versus which one is listed as the spouse. If the overall amount is a loss, then that loss over would also be filled out. So for line 8 in particular, this is for a gain or loss on the sale or exchange of property. And the proof documents would be the Federal Schedule D or the PA 40 Schedule D. For line 9, this is used to report any net rental income or loss. This can include rental property or oil and gas mineral rights royalties. The oil or gas companies would pay a person in order to have access to their property as a royalty. So the proof documents for this line would be the Federal Schedule E, Part 1, or the PA 40 Schedule E. Line 10 is used to report net business income or loss. So if the income or loss is from a business, the proof documents will be a Federal Schedule C or the PA 40 Schedule C. If the income or loss is from a farm, the proof documents would be from the Federal Form Schedule F or the PA 40 Schedule F. If the operation is at the claimant's residence, they will also need to complete the PA 1000 Schedule E, and we'll talk about that form a little bit later in this webinar, to calculate their own living space versus the space that they're using for their business. So starting with line 11A, this is for other income. Line 11A in particular is used for salaries, wages, bonus, commissions, and estate and trust income. The income would most likely come from W-2s or 1099 in terms of the proof documents. The estate and trust income will be reported on the RK-1 to the claimant from the estate or the trust. The claimant could send a copy of the RK-1 or the PA-40 Schedule J that they had to complete with their PA-40. They could also send page 1 of either the 1040 Federal Return or the PA-40 State Return, and that information would be on there as well. For line 11B, this is used for gambling and lottery winnings, including PA lottery winnings, prize winnings, or the value of other prizes. The proof documents would be a PA-40 Schedule T, the W-2G, or a win-loss statement from the casino if applicable. So taking a look at lines 11C, D, E, F, and G. Line 11C is used for inheritance, alimony, and spousal support. The proof documents for this would be a copy of the court order, support agreement, and or the inheritance return. One thing to note is that child support never gets reported, since that income is due to the child even if the payments are in the claimant's name, so that is not reported. Line 11D is used for any cash public assistance, unemployment benefits other than 306 catastrophic, and workers' compensation. For the cash public assistance, the proof documents would be a statement from the Department of Human Services. If the claimant was a renter and received them for the entire year, they would not be eligible for a rebate. They would also need to complete a PA 1000 Schedule D if they are filing as a renter and did receive cash public assistance, and we'll talk about that form as well later. The claimant would need to report any assistance they themselves and their spouse, excluding any assistance for their children. Unemployment proof documents would be the UC 1099G, which is handled by the Department of Labor and Industry, who also handles workers' compensation. Line 11E is used for loss of time, disability, and life insurance benefits. The claimant does not include the first $3,000 of total death benefit payments, and it's listed on the form. There are various ways to receive proof documents in regard to these types of income, in which the claimant will receive from the insurance company. Long-term care insurance is reported here as well if the payment is made directly to the claimant and not the care facility. So it does matter whether the payment is made direct to the claimant or whether it's to the facility. For line 11F, that's used for gifts of cash or property more than $300, but does not include from other members of the household. The proof documents would be a letter of explanation describing the property that was received. Line 11G is used for any other income that didn't get reported on any of the other specified lines, and it will also be used to annualize income from the Schedule G for a decedent who needs to remain as the claimant, and we'll talk about the Schedule G a little later. Line 12 is actually new this year. If the claimant is receiving Civil Service Retirement System benefits, and if they had to report that income on line 6, they may take a standard deduction of $8,231. If the claimant and their spouse are both receiving Civil Service Retirement System benefits, then that amount would actually be doubled if they reported that both of those incomes on line 6, and so the total here would be $16,462. If the claimant did not have that income, those benefits to report on line 6, then they would not be able to take that standard deduction. So it definitely, it ties back into line 6, and that income has to be reported on line 6 to be deducted from line 12. Line 13 is the total income from lines 4 through 11G minus any deductions from line 12 if there were any, and again, if that income was reported initially on line 6. The same amount is also entered on line 23. Just as a reminder in terms of lines 8 through 10, if there was a loss, that cannot be subtracted from other income. And so that amount is basically then just ignored. And then again, that total amount from line 13 also gets put on line 23 on page 2. And I apologize, I just saw one of the questions, so I will mention that now. It is the first 5,000. So I apologize if I misspoke. The slide is definitely correct, and it's also listed on the form. It is 5,000. Okay, so now we're looking at the beginning of page 2. And so it is important at the top of page 2 to put the claimant's Social Security number in full again, as well as their name. Lines 14 and 15. So here's where the claimant, as the owner, reports their final amounts allowed for tax purposes. So if the claimant is filing as a renter, they do not need to complete lines 14 through 15. If the claimant is filing as both a property owner and a renter, they will need to complete lines 14 through 15. So the owner would report their property tax, their total property tax. They would also need to submit copies of their receipted tax bills. Receipted means that it's stamped paid by a tax collector, and it also states the date that it was paid and the amount. A letter from the tax collector stating the same information would also suffice as well in terms of proof documents. And then once that amount is in, on line 15, you would look at Table A and then enter that amount there. And then line 15 is actually to compare the amount from line 14 to the amount entered to the right, and the lesser amount would be entered in box 15. Okay, so again, as I was mentioning about proof documentation for taxes paid, it could be county, school district, city, borough, or township. But again, it needs to be receipted, or it needs to be a letter from the tax collector with the same information in terms of when it was paid and how much was paid. So line 16 through 18 is for renters, or if someone was a property owner and renter in the same claim year. So if a claimant is filing as a renter, they would put their final amount allowed of rent paid. They will then take that final amount and multiply it by 20%. That percentage amount then goes on line 17. It gets compared to the amount of rebate allowed on line 18 based off their income from line 13. So you'd use Table B for this one. They would put the lesser amount of the two in the final box for line 18. The proof documentation for renters would include the rent certificate, which we will go over in detail, and that's the PA 1000 RC. It could also be copies of rent receipts signed by the landlord or authorized agent for each month the claimant is claiming a rebate for, or it could be a statement from a housing authority. If the claimant was an owner/renter for the claim year, as I mentioned before, they would need to fill out lines 14 through 18 as for both the property owner part and the renter part. And then line 19 is where they will compare the amount listed on line 15 and line 18 and put the lesser amount in as the final figure. Lines 15, 18, or 19 is the standard rebate amount the claimant is eligible to receive. So that's, again, how that amount is calculated. And again, for the supplemental rebate, if the claimant is eligible, the department will calculate that. The owner-renter will need to submit any proof documents as if they were an owner as well as the renter. Lines 20 through 22 are important for direct deposit. So direct deposit is the fastest way for a claimant to get their rebate, and so the department encourages people to use direct deposit. If you'd like to use direct deposit, then for line 20, the claimant would check whether it's the checking account or a savings account. Line 21 would be the routing number for the account, and line 22 would be the actual account number, all of which we need to make sure that we are able to send that via direct deposit. And again, the department does strongly encourage that. So earlier when I was talking about lines 15, 18, or 19 and getting those amounts and comparing, that information from either Table A or Table B all comes from line 23. So as you can see that those amounts are listed there, and those are also the same amounts that we talked about earlier when I talked about the maximum rebate amounts. So again, line 23, that amount should be the same as line 13. Section D of the claim form must be filled out before it can be submitted. This is actually one of the most important parts on the form because it's the claimant's signature and date. If the claimant cannot sign due to a disability, then they would just need to mark the return and then have two witnesses sign stating that it is truly the claimant who marked the return. If there is a spouse, the spouse must sign as well. If there was any preparer, power of attorney, or nearest relative who was assisting in completing the return, they must also sign. If this form is not signed before it is turned into the department, it will delay processing, so it is really important that all of the signatures that need to be on this form are on the form. Okay. So talking about then some additional documentation. So as we were going through the form, I did mention a few schedules as well as the rent certificate. So now we'll go over that in some detail. So the first part of the rent certificate is that demographic information. So it needs to be the claimant's name and, again, full Social Security number. So it also needs to list the address of the rental property, the owner's or landlord's name, address, telephone number, and if they have an employer identification number, that needs to be included as well. A lot of times the landlord will just fill out all of this information. The type of property that it is also needs to be included. One thing that's important is that a rent certificate should be filled out for each unit that is rented. So if someone moves during the year to, even if it's just another unit within the same building, another certificate has to be filled out with the dates. So that's really important, and that sometimes people miss that, especially if they're staying in the same building and they have the same landlord. They may miss that, but it is definitely important that a rental certificate is filled out for each unit that you've lived in for the claim year. So lines 4 through 8 are really important to fill out, and this form actually must complete it even if the amount is 0. So unlike with the rent certificate where I said if the amount is 0, you do not need to fill anything out and you should leave it blank. With the actual rent certificate form, it must be lines 4 through 8 must be completed even if the amount is 0. So line 4 is going to be used to report the amount of rent paid per month, Line 5 is then used to report any amount of the rent that was paid or subsidized by a government agency. Line 6 is then used to report the total monthly rent minus any government subsidies. Line 7 is used to report the number of months the claimant lived in the unit. So again, that's why it's important if you move to make sure you have a separate rent certificate. And then line 8 is used to report the total rent paid based on line 6 multiplied by line 7, and is also reported on the claim form or Schedule D, E, F as appropriate, and we will talk about that schedule shortly. The next part of the rent certificate is the landlord's oath. The landlord should fill out this information before it is submitted. There are certain instances where the landlord, for some reason, you're not able to get the landlord to fill out the certificate. If that is the case, then the occupant would fill out the occupancy affidavit. And again, this is only if you cannot get the landlord or owner to fill out the rent certificate. So one of the main things that needs to be on this form is a reason as to why the landlord was not able to fill out the form. And then the claimant's signature. The form also has to then be notarized. So it is very important that all of those fields are filled in, again, if you cannot get the landlord's signature. So the landlord's oath either needs to be filled out or the occupancy affidavit, not both together. All right. Now just briefly, we will go over some of the schedules that may need to be included. Schedule A is used if the homeowner either moved or passed away during the claim year. So if they sold one property and bought a second home, they would need to file for the first home and then the second home. If there was only the first home, they would just report the first home. They would not list any rentals here, so if they sold their home and then rented a property, they would just list the home on this form, and the rent certificate would be filled out for those months that they rented during the claim year. So on this particular form, the claimant's name needs to be included, again, as well as full Social Security number, the address for each home, and the dates occupied during the claim year. Total property taxes for each property needs to be included, number of days each property was owned and occupied, the percentage that the home was occupied, the calculations from line 1 and 3, and then the total property tax paid based on line 4. Again, there are more instructions on this form as well as in the booklet, just a high-level overview of what Schedule A is used for. Schedule B, D, and E are all on the same form. So first we'll talk specifically about the Schedule B part and what that is used for. So Schedule B is only used when the claimant was filing as a widow or widower and has now remarried. We will allow the claimant to file as a widow or widower up until the day that they wed or reach the age of 65. So if they reach the age of 65, they would now qualify on their own depending on income requirements. Or if they get remarried, they would only have been a widow or widower for part of that time then. For Schedule D, this is used for any renter who is receiving cash public assistance. So those months that they receive it, they need to deduct the month's rent from their yearly amount of rent paid. Schedule E is used for anyone, be they owner or renter, who is using part of their home for a purpose other than their personal residence. So this may be they're renting out part of their home, or it could be that they are operating a business out of their home. You would then need to deduct the property used for the business or for non-personal use from the overall property so that we can have a clear picture as to what is actually considered personal living space for the home. So that's what that schedule is used for. Schedule F and G are also on the same form, so again, I'll break these up and we'll talk first about Schedule F and what Schedule F is used for. If there is anyone other than a spouse or minor listed on the deed or the lease, the claimant will need to complete the form Schedule F. For Schedule G, this is filed for decedent. Oh, sorry, I've got to advance. Okay, Schedule G. So Schedule G is filed for a decedent who needs to remain as the claimant. So this would be if the widow or widower did not qualify on their own, was not able to file as a widower, or maybe it's a personal representative or the estate who's filing on behalf of the deceased. So the person filing on behalf of the decedent would actually have to annualize or project what the decedent would have made if the decedent had lived all year. Line 6 of this form Schedule G would then go to onto line 11G of the PA 1000. And again, if the spouse can file as the claimant, we would urge that they do that as opposed to filing this way. But there are certain circumstances, as I mentioned, where it needs to be filed this way if it's an estate representative or the living spouse wouldn't qualify based on any of those other factors. Another form that may be needed is the physician's statement. This is used for a claimant that is not covered under Social Security or the Railroad Retirement Act that is unable to submit proof of permanent and total disability. One important thing to note for this physician statement is that if the claimant was denied for Social Security disability benefits, they cannot use this form to claim a property tax or rent rebate. This is only for if they're not covered under Social Security or Railroad Retirement and have not been denied. Okay. So just some general tips and general information in terms of filing that we want to make sure that we pass along to you. The first is that payments, as I said before, will not begin to be issued until July 1st, and that is by law. Sometimes when people file earlier in the filing year, they wonder why it's taking so long to process their forms and then get the payment paid out, but that is truly because we are not allowed to issue those payments until July 1st of the year. Again, the fastest way to receive your rebate is to use direct deposit. Providing that valid phone number on the beginning of the form of the PA 1000 will allow us to make those automated calls in April and June to let you know the status of your rebate. Claimants can get assistance at no cost from the Department of Revenue, district offices, local area agencies on aging, senior centers, and state legislature's office. So you can definitely call into the department and we'll provide that information. But if you would like someone to assist you in person, there are options that are available for no cost. One important thing is to make sure that all your documents are filled out, signed, and any proof documents are included. If the documents aren't filled out correctly, or if they're not signed, or if we don't have the proof document, all of those things will actually delay processing for the forms, and so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen and we don't have to go back out for information. We do ask that you send copies for any documentation that you send us. We are not allowed to send any documents back, and so even things that may say do not copy, and in normal instances you wouldn't copy, like death certificates sometimes will say that, we will accept copies of those because, again, we will not send that documentation back. Another important thing to note is that if more than one person in the household qualifies, you should file using the person that would receive the greatest rebate. One easy way to do this might just be filling out two forms, seeing what they look like, and then sending the one with the person that's going to get the largest rebate in, because it is per household. So if you have a roommate that you're living with and both of you may qualify for it, you want to have that conversation with your roommate ahead of time and figure out which one of you is filing and then how maybe you would split that those amounts, but it's only one per household, so it is really important that you think about who might get the greatest benefit. If a spouse is living in a personal care home or assisted living facility, you may both file separate claims since you're not residing in the same household as long as rent is being paid to the facility and property tax or rent is being paid on the primary place of residence. So basically, if one person is living in the household, the other one is living in assisted living or personal care home, you can both each file because you're both living in two separate places, again, as long as rent is being, some sort of rent or amount is being paid. So if you're paying property taxes to your home and you're also paying rent to that facility, you can both file. You can file a claim on behalf of a deceased claimant as long as they lived at least 1 day during the claim year. And again, you would annualize that income if you are filing on behalf of the claimant. But again, if the spouse is eligible, you can file, you can switch over and have the spouse file as the claimant. If you receive Social Security benefits and the address they have on file is your PA address, you do not need to submit a copy of this documentation. And the reason is that we do get files from the Social Security Administration, so we can match that up in our systems if it is a Pennsylvania address that they have on file for you. If the claimant is not a new filer, so meaning that they have filed previously, they will actually receive a booklet with a pre-printed label. If the label is correct, we do ask that you use that on the form. If the label is not correct in any way, we ask that you do not use that label and instead you write in all of your information. So some people will take the label and scratch out the incorrect part and rewrite on that. But what we would say is, again, for faster processing, if any of that label is not correct, just write everything out as new. Again, if the landlord does not sign the rent certificate, please make sure and include an explanation on the form as well as your signature and making sure you get that notarized. For the tax bill cannot be stamped in red because it won't show in our imaging system. So if the tax bill, if you're sending in a stamped tax bill, it needs to be in black. And so that's just something to keep in mind when you go and you pay your taxes and then you get that stamp. A lot of areas are really good about having black stamps, but some still do use red, so that's just important for you to know. Again, as I mentioned before, include copies of any income statements as proof document. And then for proof of disability, we will need the award letter rather than a benefit statement. So sometimes people will just send in their benefit statement, but we actually need the award letter for proof of disability. Then here's where you can go to get assistance, whether it be online or there's our phone number. And then I see that we do have a couple of questions, and I do want to make sure that we get those answered before we log off.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I think the first question, I'll just read it off to you. I believe you mentioned that if someone collected public assistance for the entire year, they do not qualify for the rental rebate. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. If they're a renter and they receive cash public assistance for the entire year, they would not be eligible. If they received it for only 6 months of the year, they could file a rebate based on the other 6 months.
Great. And the next question is, what if the property is owned by a nonprofit and no property tax is being paid? Does the claimant still qualify for the rebate?
Well, that's normally what will happen in those instances. On the rent certificate, when the area that the person is renting from, when they fill in the oval that the property in which the claimant resided was exempt, the Bureau of Individual Taxes has a listing of housing authorities and other entities, and they make that determination at that time.
The next question is, head of household does not qualify. They are under 65. However, they have an adult child in the household who is disabled, but not co-head. Can they file for a rent rebate?
So are you asking if the only way that could be possible would be is if actually the child was paying the parents' rent, and then of course then the parents would be paying tax on the rental income they're receiving from the child. That would be a very rare case. I would say no.
Okay. When doing an application for both spouse in the community and one in a facility, do you still send in both income on each application?
That's actually a very good question. Basically, if they were not living together for the entire year, you would not include the other spouse's income. If one was in the home, the other one was in a nursing home for the entire year, you would not include their income. But for example, let's say the husband and the wife were living in the home for 6 months, and then let's say the wife went in the nursing home for the last 6 months. On the claim form that the owner would be filing, her income would have to be included because they were residing together for the first 6 months.
Right. Our next question, on the rent certificate, what do you put in the box for rent per month if the rent amount changed during the year? Also, what if someone did not pay all of their rent for the year even though they were there or they prepaid rent?
Well, on the rent certificate itself, on line 4, where it asks for the amount of rent per month, I would normally advise, like let's say they were paying $400 a month, then it went up to $450. Basically, I would just have people write the 400/450, but then there's an explanation box beside it where they would break it down. For the first 6 months, they paid $400, then the second 6 months, they paid $450. And for the question about the rent being prepaid, as long as the rent was paid, that would not matter. So if somebody at the beginning of the year pays rent for the entire year, or maybe they pay per quarter or whatever the case may be, it wouldn't matter. As long as the rent's paid for the months that they're claiming the rebate on, that would be fine.
The next
right,
question.
And if they did not happen to pay rent for 3 months, 6 months, they were behind in the rent, they could only claim the months that the actual rent was paid for. So if it was a tenant that paid their rent the first 10 months, was behind 2 months, but still living at the same place, they could only claim rent for the 10 months. They could not claim for the other 2 because it was not paid by when they were filing.
Great. The next question is, can people receiving rental assistance qualify? For example, people receiving the Housing Choice Voucher.
I would have to get back to you on that. I'm not really familiar off the top of my head with the Housing Choice Voucher. That can be something we can get back to the group on.
Okay. Next question. Did you say you would send out, oh yes, we will be sending out this PowerPoint as well as a link to the recording of this webinar. Our next question. I had a client that signed her rent rebate on 2/6/19, but she passed away on 3/29/19 for the 2018 rebate. Do I still have to check filing on behalf of her decedent?
Yes.
Where are the PA Department of Revenue district offices in the York area? Can that be found on the website?
Well, there's no longer a district office in the York area. Probably the closest would be Harrisburg. There's a list of district offices actually in the PA 1000 booklet. It's page 24. So if you would look at the PA 1000 instruction booklet on page 24, there's a map of the state and it lists the different district offices.
It also has their phone numbers as well.
All right. Well, we've gone through all of the questions in the chat feature, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute the line. For those on the phone, if you are in an area with a lot of background noise, I would ask that you mute yourself by pushing *6. And let's see if anybody else has any other questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
Are there any questions from folks on the phone?
No,
Looks like we're getting a lot of background noise.
The conference has been unmuted. The conference has been muted.
I'm going to mute everybody. Again, if you have a question, all you have to do is hit *7 to unmute. And if there are no more questions, then I want to thank our presenters for joining us today. I think this was a really great and informative webinar, and hopefully we'll get to see more people access this really beneficial resource. So again, thank you to everyone. Chantel, you'll have to hit *7 to unmute yourself.
So I'm just going back to the qualifications slide really quick.
All right, well, if there isn't any more questions, then we'll leave this slide up for about another minute. And thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us, and hope you will join us next time.
Yes, thank you all very much for attending our webinar. We really appreciate it.